Hi, my name is Leah Day, and welcome to Quilt Along number 4 on the Free Motion Quilting Project. So far, we've been spending several weeks working on stippling, a very classic design for free motion quilting. And now it's time to learn how to use this design in a real quilt. But of course, for a real quilt, we need to learn a few more techniques before we can really tackle that challenge. We need to learn how to quilt on a line. And this could be a line that you mark on your quilt using stencils and a marking pencil. This can be lines that you're following on a printed fabric, quilting on those lines. Or this could be stitching in the ditch, quilting round blocks and pieced shapes. And all of those things require the same skill. And that is an ability to stay on a line evenly and consistently, no matter where that line goes, no matter what angle you're stitching in. Now, truthfully, of course, there's going to be some angles that just feel so awkward and so difficult. It's advantageous to you to go on ahead and rotate your quilt so that you don't have to quilt in that angle. Do yourself a favor, just rotate your quilt. It'll make things a lot easier. And you'll see what I mean in the video today. So let's watch 3 different ways of quilting on a line. Let's get started with the first form of stitching on the line, the first way to practice, and that is simply to pick a striped print and stitch straight down the stripes. And you're feeding the fabric through the machine the way you normally feed fabric through the machine, just straight into and out the back. And you can see how my hands are moving. I come down and I stitch straight towards myself with both of my hands parallel to the needle. And my hands are flattening out the quilt, but they're also providing a lot of stability and making it very easy to stitch a straight, perfect line and stay right on that line that I'm stitching on top of. It's really important to kind of notice the locations of your hands and notice what feels comfortable to you when you're doing this. If you start stitching off, look at where your hands are. Are they way far away from your needle? Try and fiddle with that a little bit and just see what works best for you. Of course, we're not always going to have the opportunity to stitch straight down just like that in order to make straight lines. Sometimes we're going to have to stitch in an awkward angle. And so I also say rotate your quilt sideways and stitch from left to right and also from right to left with more straight lines. Just follow as many lines on your striped fabric as you like. As you can see, I've got a lot to choose from on this particular piece of striped fabric. And it really helps to try a lot of different angles and a lot of different directions because you are going to have to work with some of these in real quilts. Now, of course, if something feels really awkward, don't worry about it too much. But it's good to get at least a little bit of practice in every angle. If you stitch off the line, also don't rip your stitches out. Just keep on stitching. The more practice you get, the better you'll get at it. Now let's transfer over to another practice sandwich that I was working on, and this is a wild crazy print that I picked up at IKEA. And all I'm doing here is simply stitching along the edge of that print around that wild kind of paisley looking tree. And I'm trying to stay in that space between the black print, the design, and the white background area. Now with this particular print, I do have kind of a cheat that I could do. I could stitch mostly on the white because I'm using white thread and my stitching would be disguised. And that's kind of a neat thing. If you are stitching on, let's say, purple fabric and you're stitching around a pink applique, you might want to do the stitching in purple so that your stitches blend in with that background area. And of course it's going to be very noticeable. Like you can see every time I get off a little bit because I'm stitching white on black and it shows up. But at the same time, more than likely most of my stitches are going to end up on the white area, so it would actually be a better choice to just go with white thread here. So this is a really good way of trying out a very strange shape, fiddling around and stitching in many different angles and many different ways. And then finally, of course, kind of why we're learning this week is to stitch a real quilt. And this is a real quilt that I'm working on. Well, actually, that's a lie. This is a cheater cloth quilt, but it is the size of a real quilt, and these look at least like real blocks. I am not actually stitching in the ditch here. I am stitching on just simply printed fabric. So I did want to make that clear. But notice how I'm stitching in the ditch. I'm treating this like it's a real block, so I'm being very careful to position my hands before I start each line. And I stitch each line and I try and make that line in one single pass. I stitch straight down and then I stop. I try not to stop in the middle of a line, like right in the middle of that triangle shape, simply because that is often noticeable. If you make a little wiggle right there, your eye's going to catch that and it's going to be pretty obvious. Now you might be wondering why I'm bothering to do this in free motion and why I don't just pull out my walking foot and stitch these straight lines with a walking foot. I mean, obviously that's what a walking foot is for, right? Well, my theory is that free motion quilting is faster and more efficient, and it's also easier than hauling out that walking foot and putting it on your machine. It requires more skill to learn free motion quilting and to learn how to free motion quilt in the ditch. But at the same time, once you get good at it and you learn the skill, you'll be able to not only stitch in the ditch but then continue to fill. So if I was stitching this stitch and filling the block at the same time, I could finish off the star and then start filling it and fill it completely with stippling or whatever design I was filling it with, then wiggle my way over to the next block, stitch it in the ditch, and fill it as well. So it's a speed thing more than anything else. If I was to use a walking foot, I'd walking foot around each of these stars, having to rotate the quilt for each line. You notice that I'm not rotating the quilt. I'm keeping it in the same location. I'm just simply focusing with each point, with each direction change, which angle I'm working in. But I'm not actually rotating the quilt for each angle. With a walking foot, that's what I'd have to be doing. I have to keep continuously rotating it. That's far more time consuming. And then break thread and move on to each individual star. I wouldn't have an opportunity to fill inside or around if I was using free motion designs. I'd have to switch feet and the whole 9 yards that go with that. So really more than anything else, it's a speed thing, but it's also a skill thing. Being able to quilt on a line, even if it's a straight line, is a skill that is very important for free motion quilting. It's important because many of the quilts that you will quilt, you're going to want to be able to quilt on a line or quilt a motif, that's a mark design, on your quilt as well. But before we run off to learning about quilting on a marked line, let's see quilting in the ditch. And that's what this is. This is actually, I did stitch a border onto this quilt. So this is actually the ditch, two pieces of fabric joined together and the seam allowance is between, is underneath. And I want to specify here, I find this so much easier to do when the seams are pressed open. Of course, everybody has a different opinion about this, but notice how my stitches are kind of sinking into the space between those two pieces of fabric rather than kind of standing up to one side or the other. And I find that much, much easier to stitch that way. But it pretty much looks the same way in stitching on printed fabric. So now let's move on over to quilting on a marked line. This is a marked design, marked with a stencil, and then I always find it much easier to quilt if I have connected all the lines together with my marking pencil. So I've connected all the lines together and I'm just working my way around each petal of this flower. And personally, I find quilting a marked line easier than quilting either in the ditch or on printed fabric. And I find it easier because it's a marked line, you've marked it, it has a personal touch and a personal kind of flavor to it, so you can get off a little bit and you can fiddle with it a little bit, you can fudge a bit, and no one will know because you marked it. It's not actually in the fabric, it's not actually in the quilt, and you can kind of make it your own. Now right here, a lot of people have been asking what I do whenever I need to break thread or what I do with my thread ends, and I hide them inside the middle layer of the quilt with a cheater needle. and I have other videos on that that are a lot more clear, but I did leave that in this video so you could see how quick that can be. And getting back to the flower, I'm just going to loop around again, and notice that I am rotating this every time simply because I want to stay right on that line. So I'm rotating that little flower every time I come around to another petal. Would I do that if it was on a really big quilt and not on a little square? I probably wouldn't rotate it that much, but when you're quilting on a marked line, you want to really be able to see, and it's sometimes really hard to see the design that you've marked, so it's a good idea to rotate it and see where you're stitching and see where you're going, because that is one of those challenges that come with working with marked lines rather than printed fabric or stitching in the ditch. And here is the finished printed flower. So that's it for this week. I really hope you'll take a look in your sewing room and see what fabrics you have. Pick some fabrics that you can practice with stitching on a line. If you don't have anything appropriate, just simply mark some lines, some straight lines, some wiggly lines, some crazy all over the place lines, and try and stitch right on them. Of course, the quilt that I'm working on is not actually a real quilt. It's a cheater cloth quilt, and you can find links to purchase one for yourself on spoonflower.com. It's an easy and relatively cheap way of getting a quilt and having it very easily ready to quilt. Of course, if you'd rather quickly piece up something to play with, go on ahead and do that too. This is really a tutorial where anything goes. You can quilt on fabric that you mark, you can quilt on fabric that is, has a complex design, you can quilt on cheater cloth. It's really entirely up to you. The main point is simply to practice quilting on a line. So I can't wait to see what you come up with next week and your progress. Make sure to link up to the post on the Free Motion Quilting Project and ask any questions that you have about free motion quilting. Until next time, let's go quilt. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and find many more videos, including the first 3 quilt along videos at freemotionproject.com.